Wittenberg, 1524. An Augustinian monk writes a letter that will mark a turning point in the history of education.
Dear rulers of the German lands, I maintain that civil authorities are under obligation to compel the people to send their children to school. If the government can compel such citizens as are fit for military service to bear spear and rifle, to mount ramparts and perform other martial duties in time of war, how much more has it a right to compel the people to send their children to school, since in this case we are warring with the devil.
Words signed by Martin Luther. Words that spoke not of literacy or freedom, but of a real war for the ideological control of the people from their earliest childhood. Luther did not propose to educate. He proposed to force schooling, to compel every parent to send their children to school under the threat of fines, punishment, or even prison.
If we can force them to bear arms, we can also force them to bear an idea.
This was how the first system of compulsory public schooling began to take shape. An extension of military service, designed to mold subjects who were loyal, docile, and obedient.
The history of the school system is, in reality, the story of how the state managed to take away from parents and families the control over their own children's education. The first signs of compulsory education go back to ancient Greece. There were two very different models. On the one hand, Athens, where public schooling did exist, but access was voluntary and always depended on the decision of each family. An idea in line with Athens's democratic spirit, but truly democratic, not like today. On the other hand, Sparta took the idea of control to the extreme. There, children were seen as the direct property of the state. At 7 years old, families handed them over to the system, which raised them in what were basically barracks under a rigid and uniform program. Unlike Athens, in Sparta, every child was treated the same, with the same opportunities, no matter their background.
The thirst for control always lurks where freedom exists. And in Athens, it did not take long for voices to rise, praising the virtues of the Spartan model. A public, equal, compulsory, and uniform education. One of its most fervent defenders was none other than the brightest and most ambitious architect of utopias in Athens, Aristocles, better known as Plato. So captivated was he by order and control that he could not help but envy Sparta's iron discipline. But in a society like Athens, where critical thought upheld the very foundations of its democracy, they soon understood that freedom cannot survive within a system built on coercion.
In his works, The Republic, and also The Laws, Plato imagines his perfect state. What he actually describes is basically Sparta, a system of compulsory instruction where people belong to the state, private property doesn't exist, and personal ties are suppressed, especially the family, which he saw as a threat to political unity. He He wanted to dissolve the family, to eliminate loyalties and affections that could compete with the state. Everything, absolutely everything, had to serve a single goal: shaping citizens trained in the civic values the state itself defined as desirable. And here's the thing: for Plato, anything the state did was justified, even lying. Yes, lying as an educational method seemed entirely legitimate to him. According to Plato, to educate was to create convincing narratives that justified the state's impositions. He called them noble lies. For him, the important thing was not truth, but maintaining control and order.
The Spartan model, rigid, equal, and compulsory, could not withstand the passage of time. The human soul, born for freedom, cannot long endure the chains of imposed duty. It was the Athenian model, free, voluntary, and unequal, that survived, crossing centuries of empires, wars, and doctrines. And despite the many attempts to subjugate it, education remained free for more than 2,000 years. It was conceived as a profoundly human act, the purest expression of freedom, to decide which learnings had shaped your life, to pass them on to your children, and to trust others to transmit those things you yourself might have wished to receive.
During the Middle Ages, schools were mainly run by the church or by private teachers who offered their services for money, obviously. Anyone with knowledge could teach children in a neighborhood or a village how to read and write, as long as their parents agreed, of course. But there was no need for a royal permit or a government license. Kings and rulers didn't interfere in education. Wealthier families would hire a teacher for their children, while poorer families would pool resources with neighbors or bring in a teacher for all the children in the village. There were also charitable works that offered free instruction in parishes and convents. In fact, it was very common for poor or orphaned children, especially in the cities, to receive basic education for free as part of Christian charity. That's why so many teachers were priests, monks, or nuns, who saw this task as part of their religious vocation. Most often, families contributed to their children's education as best they could, but never by imposition. It was always voluntary. It's true that education wasn't compulsory, but it also wasn't guaranteed. Parents and students had to find solutions, ask for help, make deals, and commit to exchange favors in return.
Lives became intertwined through voluntary commitments and reciprocal favors. Human networks forged in trust, in the shared value of knowledge, and in the genuine desire to learn. There were no universal rights or obligations, only free agreements, sealed by a word, between those who offered their knowledge and those willing to strive to receive it. There were as many possibilities as there were voluntary agreements to be made.
In the poorest areas, many parents didn't want to send their children to school. Kids were a source of labor, sometimes essential for the family's survival. It was common for children to attend classes only on certain days or in certain seasons, when there was no work in the fields or the workshop. Many learned the family trade from an early age, especially among artisans or merchants. That way, they inherited the tools, the shop, the clientele, and the family's reputation, which was no small thing. And if a child showed talent for something else or wanted to learn a different craft, there was the path of the apprentice. They lived and worked with a master craftsman in exchange for food, lodging, and training. And, of course, guaranteed hands-on practice. For many young people, it was the way out of the countryside. You could apprentice as a seamstress, a midwife, a clockmaker, a carpenter. You could even apprentice to a notary. In the end, everyone carved out a path as best they could, according to their skills, their abilities, and the opportunities they could grasp. But there were also many children who never escaped absolute poverty. Orphans in rural areas, or kids from families with no land. For them, the only way out was for parents to give their children to the church, into a monastery or convent, where they would be trained and educated, in exchange for a lifetime of service. They gave away the only thing they had, their life. But it's important to understand, for people in the Middle Ages, lack of education was not really the problem. That's something we only see as a problem today. For them, the real problem, with capital letters, was the lack of food and resources. It would take centuries until human ingenuity made food more abundant and literacy ceased to be a privilege and became a useful tool for everyone.
In the Middle Ages, family, survival, and defense were the pillars of life. Time was a precious good, and every hour had to be spent working just to stay alive. Knowledge was not measured in titles or diplomas, but in something far simpler, useful or useless. And only each person could know what was truly useful in their own circumstances. Learning to read or write was not valuable in itself. It was so only for a few. For most, it was far more urgent to learn how to build a house, to sew, to fish, or to cultivate the land.
Reading and writing were useful skills in 3 areas: in religious life, as a strategic resource in war, and in certain trades, notaries, officials, merchants. In all of these, men had the advantage. In the church, men could rise higher in the hierarchy. In the army, a soldier who could read and write was far more valuable, which improved his chances of survival. Rulers knew this. They could trust him with orders, reports, or maps, and that could decide the outcome of a war. Women, who did not go to war or take part in the heavy trades of the time, many of which relied on brute strength, found more value in other kinds of learning: managing the household economy, raising children, and keeping the home efficient. At that time, domestic tasks were not seen as minor at all, and bearing children, their main duty, was considered essential. That was how society understood it. Remember that child mortality in those days was about 50% in the first 5 years. The survival of the family, and education as well, depended on women.
In medieval Europe, wherever records exist, male literacy doubled and even tripled that of women. A difference marked not by intelligence, but by necessity, and by the usefulness of a resource that was exceedingly scarce. But among the elites, the story was very different. The gap between men and women narrowed dramatically. Wealth and economic prosperity were the keys that opened the doors of knowledge. Many noble women, such as Hildegard of Bingen, Christine de Pizan, Matilda of Canossa, Héloïse of Argenteuil, or Eleanor of Aquitaine, among many others, received an extraordinary education for their time. They became physicians, politicians, composers, writers, theologians, advisors to popes, kings, and emperors. In their world, the true limit was not sex. It was scarcity,
Basic education meant teaching children to read, to write, and to do simple arithmetic. But as knowledge became more specialized, Latin, logic, philosophy, or law, the cost rose sharply. Very few people could teach it, and books, ink, parchment, all of that was expensive. By the late Middle Ages in the 15th century, the average literacy rate in Europe was about 15% for men in towns and barely 5% for women. In wealthy cities like Florence, Venice, or Bruges, the numbers were higher. Nearly 30% of men and around 10% of women could read and write. But in rural areas, literacy barely reached 2%. Where there was more economic activity, there was more wealth, and it was that wealth that made education possible. And look here. In this chart, you can clearly see how, starting in the 16th century, literacy in Europe began to rise, until it reached the 99% we have today.
Sometimes, great changes do not begin with plans or strategy, but with a small gesture that no one deems significant until it completely transforms a society. On All Hallows' Eve of 1517, in the silence of Wittenberg, an Augustinian monk approached the church door with a parchment in one hand and a hammer in the other. Martin Luther nailed there his 95 Theses. They were not mere complaints. They were a direct challenge to the greatest authority of his time, the Catholic Church. In them, he not only denounced the sale of indulgences and the corruption of high offices, he dared to defy the Pope of Rome himself, questioning his authority and denying his right to grant God's forgiveness.
Even before the Protestant Reformation erupted, Europe was already steeped in a climate of sharp criticism toward the Church. Corruption was plain to see. Ecclesiastical offices were bought and sold, and everybody knew it. Meanwhile, the clergy lived in open luxury while demanding tithes and charity from the faithful. But the spark that finally set off the break was the sale of indulgences, granting forgiveness of sins in exchange for money. By then, indulgences had become a multi-million guilder business for the Church. According to historians such as Kohler and Cameron, at the beginning of the 16th century, indulgences accounted for around 10% of the Church's total income. In some campaigns, they even surpassed the annual revenue from the tithe. The most scandalous case, however, came in the 2 years just before Luther published his 95 Theses. Between 1515 and 1517, Pope Leo X launched a massive indulgence campaign across the Holy Roman Empire to finance the building of St. Peter's Basilica, and, not incidentally, to pay off some of his own debts. That campaign alone accounted for between 40 and 50% of the Church's income during those 2 years, raising tens of thousands of florins across the empire. And as always in big business, bankers stood behind it. Houses such as the Fuggers, the Welzers, and the Medicis managed the flow of money, and of course, took their share. Indulgences had little left of a spiritual act. They had become, in truth, a first-class financial operation.
In a world where money could not be conjured out of nothing, selling God's forgiveness was an immensely lucrative business for those who held the monopoly on truth and the keys to heaven. But at the University of Wittenberg, a young professor and Augustinian monk, concerned for the salvation of his soul, chose not to take part in the business and to protest instead. After earning a doctorate in theology and years of studying the Holy Scriptures, he reached a conviction that clashed head-on with Rome. Salvation and God's forgiveness could not be bought with gold or with a handful of florins. They could only be attained through faith. Martin Luther dared to do the unthinkable, to think for himself, to question dogmas, and to defy the most powerful authority of his age. By nailing his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Church, he opened a debate that would set Europe ablaze. And he did so by using precisely what, years later, he himself would try to prevent others from using again: the ability to question the established order. No one understood better than he the reach and the immense power of free thought, nor the magnitude of the earthquake that disobedience could unleash in the foundations of any structure of power. In 1524, he wrote a letter to the rulers of the Holy Roman Empire to persuade them to impose public schools with compulsory attendance. There, every child would learn to read and write, but above all, they would be indoctrinated to fight the ideas of the devil, to think as good Christians, and to serve as loyal subjects of the empire. Thus began a new chapter in the history of humanity: education as a tool of state control. A story of imposition, uniformity, and the repression of that which the powerful fear above all else: independent thought.
Despite what many might think, the roots of all modern state school systems are not in Sparta or in classical Greece. The model we know today was born in the 16th century, with Luther and, above all, with his right hand, Philip Melanchthon. They were the ones who designed the first modern plan for state education, and we have no evidence at all that either of them ever looked to Sparta for reference or inspiration, even if the similarities are striking. The historical continuity of the Prussian model of education, from Luther's time to the present, is perfectly documented. In both Europe and America, the trace of this model can be followed without interruptions or gaps, and we can trace it into Asia as well. Japan imported the model in the late 19th century during the Meiji Restoration, fascinated by the discipline, obedience, and military efficiency it produced. Soon after, following the fall of the Qing dynasty, China adopted it too, and many other Asian countries followed, either through European colonization by the British, French, or Dutch, or simply by copying Japan. In every case, we find the same system. There are slight adjustments here and there, but no real changes. Even the so-called modern methodologies, or active pedagogies, sold to us today as educational innovation are nothing new. They have been on the table for more than 2 centuries. In fact, their origin goes back to the 18th century, when Rousseau and Pestalozzi strongly criticized the state model and defended an education focused on the full development of the individual, placing the child at the center of learning, encouraging active participation, and promoting autonomy. And I am not putting this in modern words. Those were their very words.
From the days of Athens to the dawn of the 16th century, education was a responsibility shared by families, communities, and teachers. A pact of trust, not of coercion. Luther offered princes and kings something irresistible: the fall of the Pope of Rome, and with it, absolute control over the legitimacy of their actions, the power to control truth, good, and evil. Absolutism was beginning to take shape. He promised to forge loyal, obedient, and disciplined subjects, men and women who would not only pay more taxes, but do so willingly, convinced it was their duty as good citizens. He offered rulers the most efficient armies ever seen, able to communicate in writing, a formidable tactical advantage at that time. and a meticulously ordered society where everyone shared a single story. A convincing narrative proclaiming the state as the only source of legitimacy. Luther saw in compulsory schooling the tool of social and ideological control. He needed to domesticate thought, to standardize belief, and to command the human will.
The princes accepted the deal. They gave Luther resources, inspectors, soldiers, and, of course, a share of the new taxes they would collect through the brand new schools. Because with the church out of the way, if the state was now providing public education, taxes had to rise. Whether people were forced into it or had never asked for it, that didn't matter. At first, they sold it as nothing more than a simple change of hands. What was no longer paid to Rome would now be paid to the state, plus a little extra to cover education. But in practice, taxes rose sharply. We don't have exact figures, since there were not yet officials recording every detail, but there is plenty of historical evidence to show that setting up this entire system brought an enormous extra cost to the state. And that meant constant tax hikes, along with more than one peasant revolt. And while Luther would have gladly burned at the stake any parent who refused to send their children to school, the princes, being more practical, preferred to keep them alive and fine them with ever higher penalties. They were only executed if they failed to pay their taxes. In short, people were told they were being freed from the chains of Rome so they could save their souls and reach heaven. They were forced to send their children to school to save them from the devil, and their taxes were raised, freed from Rome and bound to the state, though that last part never made it into the official narrative. And then, year after year, taxes kept climbing to pay for more inspectors and more administrators and keep the whole system running. And everyone was happy, because that was what it meant to be a good citizen, and nobody wants to be a bad one.
In 1524, the very year Luther wrote his letter, the first Lutheran public schools were founded in Gotha. In the autumn of 1528, Luther and his disciple Philip Melanchthon published the Saxon School Plan, the first fully systematic program of education, planned and designed to educate the entire population equally. From then on, it would be the state that determined what must be learned, who could teach it, how, when, where, for what purpose, and with what arguments it should be justified. The gears of the first state education system were already in motion. All that remained was to impose it by force on the whole population. And they did not have to wait long. In 1559, at the Castle of Stuttgart, the Duke of Württemberg enacted the first education law, requiring all boys to attend school. From then on, schools began to keep attendance records. Educational inspectors were appointed to oversee the enforcement of content, and parents who failed to comply with their duty were fined or even imprisoned. School became a civic duty, a political obligation that came before military service. In the years that followed, public schools were created in every town and village of the Holy Roman Empire. The public and compulsory school system designed by Luther and Melanchthon began to spread and take root throughout the empire. Like a web woven from power.
Melanchthon was the first to talk about curriculum design and the first to build a fully systematized pedagogy, one that looks strikingly similar to what we see today in almost any school system, even the Finnish one that gets so much praise. In reality, they're all nearly the same, because they're all systems for educating, which, honestly, should already sound pretty disturbing, at least to me. But anyway, what Melanchthon did was to structure all the content into subject-based curricula, exactly the way it's done today. Each subject was laid out and sequenced into different courses, according to the student's age, and the learning objectives that had been defined in advance for each stage.
Melanchthon was the first to imagine something that until then would have seemed unthinkable: a fully systematic program of education, carefully planned and designed to educate the entire population equally, everyone, without exception. An education system capable of uniting all under the same values, and of course the same faith, the Lutheran one.
Both Melanchthon and Luther didn't see people. They saw a collective, a mass. They weren't concerned with the well-being of children as individuals. They saw them as cogs in a machine, as if they were just screws. So the idea was simple: apply the same education plan to all children, no matter how different they were, and you could implant a single system of moral and civic values that for the first time would be under control. Under the control of the state, to be precise.
Control was the real problem. A problem Luther understood to perfection. He himself had managed to dethrone the supreme pontiff, fracture Europe, and forever alter the rules of the political game, armed only with critical thought and the audacity to question established power. That is why what had given him victory was also what he feared the most. How could one dominate a system of social values that by nature is diverse, unpredictable, and decentralized? The only way was to chain it, to turn it into a single uniform model, subjected to an official morality that guaranteed blind obedience to the laws dictated by power. Thus, all dissent, political, religious, or personal, could be stifled before it was even born. The state and the Lutheran Church were then welded together into a single structure of power, two faces of the same coin, inseparable and indivisible.
The lasting value of Luther's appeal of 1524 was not so much its direct effect as the sacred associations which it established in Germany between national religion and the educational duty of the individual and the state. Thus, without doubt, there was created that sound public opinion which made the principle of compulsory school attendance easy of acceptance in Prussia.
That was the very goal pursued by the world's first systems of state schooling. The school as a lever of social control, a tool of the state to shape consciences and guarantee the religious and political unity of the nation.
The underlying message was simple: be quiet, obey, and send your children to school so they can learn to be quiet and obey even better. Anyone with kids knows this. Children are the strictest guardians of the rules they've been taught. If you tell them, don't cross on red, and then one day you do it in front of them, you don't need the police to stop you. The child will scold you. For them, that rule is absolute because that's how it was passed on, with no nuance, no context. Adults, on the other hand, know that some rules depend on circumstances. If the street is empty, crossing on red may not involve any real risk. But a child's prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for analyzing, weighing options, and making decisions, is not yet fully developed, so they interpret the world in a rigid, literal way. Learning up to about the age of 8 is based mainly on the internalization of rules, learned through imitation, repetition, and emotional association. The child learns, red means don't cross. To educate would be to explain why the traffic light exists and to help them understand when the rule is useful and when it is not. To indoctrinate is simply to say, don't cross because it's red, and leave it at that. And that's the problem. When you teach only obedience to rules and not the reasons behind them, you end up building dogmas, generation after generation. Dogmas that over time become unquestionable. Each generation grows a little more submissive than the one before, until finally, obedience becomes automatic and questioning feels uncomfortable, because we've been taught to avoid debate, instead of seeing it as the most natural way to learn. That, in fact, is what it means to think critically, to put your own ideas to the test, and to see whether they can really stand up to external criticism.
Melanchthon's idea was masterful. He designed a system in which citizens had to be convinced that education is the highest priority, and that, above all, they must trust the system, trust the institutions of the state, and follow the rules.
Only obedience to the laws ordained by the state will protect you from chaos and savagery.
Once the system was set in motion, it no longer needed to be enforced by force. The machinery would move on its own. The school would produce docile citizens and faithful Lutheran subjects, convinced that they were freely choosing what was right. Thus, the system perpetuated itself, generation after generation, with citizens ever more obedient, more compliant, and, paradoxically, far more educated.
Luther stamped upon his party that character of political dependence and that habit of passive obedience to the state which it has ever since retained.
The consequences of Luther's system were enormous. It took off like a rocket. In the rural areas of the Holy Roman Empire, where barely 2% of the population could read and write at the start of the 16th century, literacy rose to nearly 35% by the mid-17th. And in the cities, which started at around 25%, it was not unusual to see rates above 60% by the early 18th. From there, they kept climbing to levels never seen before, and the impact on the army was immediate. Suddenly, soldiers could read orders, interpret maps, and coordinate far more effectively. They no longer depended on a captain shouting commands at them. They could receive detailed instructions in writing, even from a distance. The result was that the armies of the Holy Roman Empire and later of Prussia became far more precise and far more lethal. An educated soldier doesn't just shoot better, he obeys better, and for those in power, that was pure gold.
The establishment of the school system also worked its magic on the economy. Revenues grew enormously, wealth multiplied, and the productivity of each worker reached new heights. But none of this escaped the watchful eye of the state, which, like a jealous guardian, kept every fruit of that progress under its control.
Keep in mind that, almost overnight, peasants could read and write. They had access to technical manuals, could measure land, calculate proportions. Apprentices in workshops could now follow written instructions and replicate designs directly from a sheet of paper. This new capacity to write and communicate asynchronously not only improved agriculture and multiplied the productivity of craft workshops, it also laid the foundations for more complex industries. In the Holy Roman Empire, textile factories grew. Iron foundries produced standardized parts, printing presses expanded, and shipyards multiplied. Over time, this entire fabric of production gave rise to machinery industries, to engineering, and eventually to the manufacture of vehicles and advanced weaponry.
As the spoken word was replaced by the written word, the power of the state grew. Now, everything was recorded and signed. Taxes were collected with precision. Fraud and evasion reached historic lows. And it became ever harder to escape the gaze and the collecting hand of the state.
tax revenues kept climbing non-stop through the 17th and 18th centuries, and the 19th and 20th were worse. Meanwhile, the state kept growing. As it expanded and took on more roles, it had to hire more officials. Soon there was an army of bureaucrats who, of course, needed their diplomas certified by the state itself. And to keep them all on the payroll, more taxes. And that's how this loop began, the one we're still in today.
In 1763, Frederick the Great extended compulsory primary education to girls as well. He conceived education and the army as the two great pillars upon which Prussian identity had to be built. Prussia achieved something unprecedented: a national, centralized, and perfectly articulated system where school, bureaucracy, and army were interwoven like the gears of a single machine of discipline. A model carefully designed and coordinated to maintain control over the moral values that govern society. To align wills, to standardize thought, and to turn each citizen into a functional piece of the state apparatus. Education thus became the factory of citizens in the service of the state.
An instructed and literate people can be governed with greater ease.
But this domination had to be presented as an act of benevolence. The state did not only demand obedience, it needed you to believe that you obeyed for your own good, that you should even end up thanking them for it. After all, they were the wise ones, the ones who had taught you how to think, the ones who had shaped every idea that inhabits your mind. If everything you knew had been taught to you by them, if everything you are today you owed to them, how could you ever think they might be wrong? How could you even doubt that they had the right and the duty to decide for you? The perfect trick: to convince you that your freedom was safer in their hands than in your own.
The prince is to the nation he governs what the head is to man. His duty is to see, think, and act for the whole community.
After Prussia's defeat at the hands of Napoleon in 1806, Frederick William III interpreted the disaster as a warning. If the state wished to be strong again, it had to start at the root: education. That same year, his minister Von Stein pushed through a radical reform. He abolished all remaining private schools and placed all education under the direct control of the Ministry of the Interior. In 1810, it was decreed that all teachers had to pass an official state exam. And in 1812, a compulsory graduation test was established for children to leave the school system. If they failed, they could not exit the system. The body of school inspectors was also expanded, charged with ensuring that everything conformed exactly to what the state dictated.
In 1814, after Napoleon was defeated, Prussia introduced for the very first time compulsory service for all young men. But since they could not go beyond the official cap of 42,000 soldiers set by the Congress of Vienna, they created a system known as the Crimper system. Every year, they trained 42,000 recruits, kept them in service for 12 months, just enough to prepare them fully, then sent them home as reservists, bringing in a new batch. In just a few years, they had hundreds of thousands of men well trained and ready for mobilization at any moment. The Prussian model of schooling acted as the antechamber of the army. From the classroom, they instilled discipline, obedience, loyalty to the nation, history, mathematics, and practical skills useful for artillery, logistics, or engineering. The schoolroom was, in truth, the first barracks.
By 1834, no one in Prussia could access a skilled job without the corresponding diploma issued by the state. It was even forbidden for a company or a family to hire a professional without state approval. From that moment on, they would not only control the future soldier, but also the future judge, notary, teacher, doctor, lawyer, civil servant. The future of every citizen lay in their hands, and submission to the state was no longer a virtue. It became the only condition for social existence.
People's lives got much better, at least when it came to money. No question about that. But the cost was high. Every day they were under tighter control, with less room to decide. The ones who reaped the real rewards were the rulers. More wealth, more power, more than ever before. The results looked so impressive that others rushed to copy them. The first was Calvin, who in 1536, just 10 years after Luther launched his Saxon education plan, built in Geneva a system almost the same, only tougher, stricter.
Calvin's influence spread even further than Luther's, weaving a network that reached every corner of Europe. Geneva became the beating heart of Calvinism, a beacon that drew students, scholars, and the curious from across the continent. With every traveler who returned home, his educational model spread. In Scotland, John Knox founded the Presbyterian Church and sought to build a network of schools in every village. In France, the Huguenots demanded universal education. And in Navarre, Queen Jeanne d'Albret imposed it by decree. Calvinist Holland followed the same path in 1609. But Calvin's mark did not stop in Europe. It crossed the ocean with the Puritans to New England, where the first public and compulsory education system of America took root, a model that, from there, would expand until it embraced the entire world.
Today, the state claims full control of education, even calling it a lever of social change, with all the risks that such power brings. A lever, after all, exists to multiply the force behind it. The danger is clear. If only the state holds that lever, then it holds the moral ground itself. And we must remember, the will of the state is nothing more than the will of those few who seize and steer its machinery. We have let the debate on education shrink into arguing which system to impose on everyone, instead of realizing that such an imposition is not only needless, but deeply dangerous. The problem before us is grave. For once we have surrendered the right to educate our children, what can we do when the state, quite simply, does not educate?